You see, what I want to talk to you is about exchange rate manipulation, current account imbalances, and monetary policy. When I started to get interested in that topic, I did not know what the outcome would be. So I really learned during that period that the topic is much more complicated, much more political than I originally had thought, and that it is quite clear to come to an exact outlook and result what exchange rate manipulation really is. Therefore, we will have to discuss a little bit what is that, how can we react to that, criticism and defense of that. I will start with a little bit background of the discussion, give you an overview about the debate. Then I will have a closer look on reserve accumulation, quantitative easing, and at the end I will try to discuss a little bit, what is that, what is the problem behind that, what perhaps the positive sides, etc., etc. If you have a look on the historical debate about exchange or historical aspects about exchange rate manipulation, we can see indeed during the 19th century, during the gold standard, it didn't play an important role. It became an important topic after the breakdown of the gold standard, that means in the 1930s. I think it's quite obvious why. Because it became a topic then when exchange rate itself became a political issue. So the political dimension in the whole story is enormously important. And indeed, we have the problems, the discussions which starts in the 1930s, and then also, if you have a look on the Bretton Woods Agreement, indeed, we see a small passage there which clearly says that the member states should avoid manipulating exchange rates in order to gain an unfair competitive advantage over other members. So the political dimension of that whole story is from the beginning a very important part of the whole debate. Now, if we try to go on one step, the first question which arises indeed is, how can we see what is exchange rate manipulation and what is not exchange rate manipulation? What are the clear indicators that the country is manipulating exchange rate? And if we have a closer look on that, we see, oh, that's the starting point of the whole problem, because we do not have that clear indicator. For sure, we can't say under or overvaluation of the currencies, but then we have to know what the correct exchange rate should be. And as we have discussed already 2 days ago, it is sometimes quite easy to say if an exchange rate is out of line for a huge dimension, we can say, okay, something is wrong here. But in order to define the correct exchange rate, that's quite a difficulty. We may have a look on the current account. Big surpluses or big deficits can be seen as an indicator. But we cannot automatically say that all the countries have to have current account close to zero. There may be good reasons why some countries have a deficit, other countries have a surplus. So also current account is not that easy as an indicator. We may have a look on reserve accumulation. That is used very much. We will see it later as an indicator of exchange rate manipulation. But there may also be good reasons that some countries accumulate reserves, especially in periods of think about after the Asian crisis, of volatility of flows, volatility of exchange rates, then accumulation of reserves may also seen as a necessary instrument of one or the other countries in order to have the possibility of stabilizing interventions. Yeah, and we may also have a direct view on capital flows. How are they developing? What are the direction? What are the amounts of that? So also that may give us some hints concerning what exchange rate manipulation is, but there is no clear-cut indicator which says here is manipulation, there is no manipulation. So all the indicators for itself are in some way questionable. Therefore, a huge part of the debate also is going in direction, what are the aims behind exchange rate manipulation? The easiest and perhaps most used point in that discussion is countries try to have some kind of competitive advantage. So having competitive advantage may be linked in some way to economic growth. It may sustain economic growth in some way. It may sustain employment. They may be interested in some structural developments where the exporting sector may play an important role. Normally, we do not talk about exchange rate manipulation, even if that is also the case in the other way around. Exchange rates often are used as an instrument in order to sustain monetary stability, in some way as an anchor for the internal monetary developments. Also that is, even if a different sense from the others, some kind of manipulation of the exchange rate. We have a lot of very specific political aims which may play a role from military aspects to whatever we may have. So another problem arises here, because if we have a closer look on the aims itself, we see that the exchange rate only is one dimension of the problem. So the problem normally is something which may use the instrument of exchange rate, but the exchange rate is only a part of by far vaster instrumental basket which are used in order to achieve that instruments. We may have, or in the discussion therefore, often we have a closer look on what kind of concrete instruments are used in order to manipulate exchange rates. So intervention in the foreign exchange market is one important thing here. Monetary policy, for sure. Quantitative easing, interest rates, they have an influence on the exchange rate. We know all that. We may also talk about de-revaluation, internal de-revaluation. I will come back to that a little later. We will think about capital account management, also fiscal policy even may have influence, more or less direct to the exchange rate. So if we have a look on the greater part of the instruments which may be used, again we have the problem that internal and external cannot be separated clearly. The greater part of the instruments also has internal and external effects. So therefore, if we have a closer look on the current debate, two different debates are at the center of the whole story. The longest debate here we have coming from the United States. In the last years, mainly in the relationship to China, in earlier years concerning Japan especially. They try to focus what are the currency manipulators indeed. And we have a second debate which is starting more from the emerging market economies, and it's more the relationship to the industrialized world, especially since quantitative easing becomes a more important story here. So the background of at least the debates in the last years is clearly global imbalances and what we may call the Great Recession. So if we have a look on, or start from having a look on the current account developments, indeed we can see some interesting features here. If we start from the industrialized world, we can see, okay, the current account deficit, the well-known current account deficit by the United States, has been reduced from more or less 6%, 2006, 2007, to a level of half of that. That means 3% in the last years. United Kingdom, more or less the same level. The surpluses of Japan are clearly reduced. Germany is a little bit the exception here, because Germany is the only country which indeed has increased current account surplus. If we have a look on other parts of the world, we can see indeed imbalances are still there, but they are much lower than they had been before. We may have a look on the Asian countries here. There are still China, Malaysia, which have clearly a current account surplus, but it's much lower than it had been. And we have even some countries here, India, we have talked about that, also Indonesia, which are going slowly in the direction of deficit. Latin American countries, at the end we can see they are all more or less in a deficit position. That's smaller for Argentina, and it's bigger for countries like Brazil, Chile, but Latin America all over, at least the more important countries, they're all developing in direction of a more or less clear deficit position. Let's organize the discussion here, mainly having a look on the different instruments which may be used in order to manipulate exchange rates. The first, mainly coming from the United States, discussion is the problem of reserve accumulation. The discussion, as I said, started already more or less 10 years ago. Japan bashing was the topic in that period mainly. In the following years, Japan became more and more at the center of the focus. Then in the last 2-3 years, we also have an important political debate about that. The US Senate passed a bill that would require the Commerce Department to pose tariffs on Chinese goods and services when the Treasury finds out that indeed it is manipulating the exchange rate. In order to promote that kind of discussion, the United States are looking mainly on reserve accumulation. So the question here is indeed how much the reserve accumulation of different countries has had an influence on the global imbalances, and for sure mainly on the deficit of the United States side. And the outcome of the United States research is going in direction that indeed the reserve accumulation, mainly reserve accumulation in dollar, a lower part reserve accumulation in euro, has reached 1 trillion in recent years, and that corresponds more or less, concerning the United States alone, to a trade deficit of 500 billion US dollars per year, and that loss would cost the United States between 1 and 5 million jobs. What is the argument for the whole story? The story, or the reasoning, compares in some way the reserve accumulation and the development of international current accounts. It starts from reserve accumulation, which in Asian countries was much stronger than all over the globe. Indeed, we have all over the globe an increasing accumulation of reserves. During the last 10-12 years, it was especially strong in the Asian world, and we also can see In some countries in the Middle East, in North Africa, reserves increased enormously. In Eastern Europe in a certain period, and reserves also, even if less, increased in Latin America. Now, if we continue with that kind of reasoning, we simply can compare current account and reserve accumulation. And that figure gives the imagination, at least, that there is a certain connection between both sides.
Which countries are these? In this
that are all the countries which accumulate reserves. Okay. It's 20 countries at the end which are the strongest accumulators of reserves. You will see the list of the countries a little later. Okay, they are accumulating reserves, and parallel to that we have current account imbalances. So indeed, different empirical studies have been done, especially by the Peterson Institute of International Economics, and they all try to show that an intervention of $1 has an immediate effect on current account imbalances between 70 cents and 90 cents. So there is a direct connection by that. And if we were able to reduce the reserve accumulation, that would be an important, perhaps the most important part in order to overcome the global imbalances story. Following a study by Bergson, we indeed can distinguish three groups of countries. We have the non-interveners. There, first, for sure, we have the United States. Then we have the European Union as a whole, as a non-intervener country. We have a second group, the defensive interveners. They make intervention, but they make intervention mainly in order to stabilize their own position. And we have the real currency manipulators. That's mainly Asian countries, it's the oil exporters, and some other countries. In order to define exactly what manipulators are, 4 criteria are developed here. It's the level of the foreign exchange reserves, that if they exceed more than 6 months of imports. It's the growth of the reserves, if they grow stronger than the GDP. It's the current account that I look on, and it's a minimum requirement of income level. So that 4 criteria are used by Bergson and his research team, and the outcome is, indeed, we have, if they have a look on the real manipulators, so they are all part of that later group, of that third group here. We have the Asian countries, from China, Hong Kong, up to Thailand, which are manipulating the exchange rate. We have a second group of countries, which are the oil exporters. They also manipulate the exchange rate in that way, based on the criteria we have seen before. And we have some other countries that are all countries which are rather small, but 2 of them are European. Israel is considered as being in the same group of that sort. They are all identified by that research as the active manipulators of exchange rate. Now, based on that, some political considerations are added. For example, that Israel should be allowed to be an exchange rate manipulator for political reasons. That also the oil exporting countries should not be seen as manipulators directly, because what would happen if they stop or reduce the exports of oil in order to reduce their surplus? But then that group is at least the group where the discussion should focus on, and they make clear policy proposals here. First round, we should try to find voluntary agreements that the countries reduce the surpluses in current account and end the accumulation of currency reserves. If that doesn't work, the United States should make countervailing currency intervention against that countries or currencies. If that's not enough, tax on earnings on dollar assets should be introduced. If we go on, import duties against that countries should be introduced, and at the end of the story, also the World Trade Organization should be part of that story, and the countries should be punished indirectly or directly by the World Trade Organization for their manipulation of currencies. So that's the proposals, that's the discussion. Up to now, it did not have direct policy consequences, even if some kind of pressure in direction of voluntary agreements for sure does exist, but the other steps are still in consideration, not part of reality. Now we have a second debate, a completely different debate from that. That's more about quantitative easing. Indeed, if we have a look, I do not have to repeat that, you all know it, that quantitative easing from the United States, from the part of Japan, from, even if it's smaller, part from the euro area, has become an important dimension of economic, of monetary policy. G7 has discussed it a little bit. They agree on that as long as the goals, the aims of that are mainly domestic. One of the countries which started the discussion about that was Brazil. India also made intervention in that. Brazil officially asked for the introduction of study groups concerning the relationship between exchange rates and international trade. The difficulty is that up to now we do not have clear results from that debate. We also may consider some of the contributions here heard in the workshop as part of that. The Brazilian initiative goes not only against China in the sense of manipulating exchange rate by reserve accumulation, but also and mainly against an ultra-loose quantitative easing monetary policy in the rich countries. So what are the problems here mainly? Okay, quantitative easing creates instability in the whole international system. Volatility, which has direct effects on emerging economies. We have an enormously high volatility in asset prices. We have tendencies of bubble development, of distortions of the money market. We also have, as a further problem, the appreciation of national currency, therefore the loss of competitiveness, of deficits in current account, in trade, and we have the middle and long-term problem of increase of external indebtedness, and therefore the increasing dependency on capital inflows and the problem of the reversion of that. What are the possible policy answers to that discussed? The first, what normally is proposed here, is macroeconomic policy should react to that. Macroeconomic policy should try to stop, at least to lower capital inflows. What can be used here? Lowering interest rates. The The problem, therefore, logically, is that within the countries, the risk of inflation, of bubble developments may increase. The alternative, or one alternative, would be to allow for the currency appreciation. The problem again then is we have overvaluation, we have the problem of competitiveness and of external deficits. Another alternative discussed very much here is the intervention foreign exchange market. We can distinguish here between sterilized interventions and unsterilized interventions. If we use sterilized interventions, which means that indeed interest rates remain relatively high concerning to the conditions within the countries, the whole story may be self-defeating because it cannot really stop the inflow of capital. If it's unsterilized, we have problems similar as we have seen before concerning low interest rates, that indeed we have excessive liquidity, inflation, bubble developments. Last but not least, an important or increasing important part of the discussion is the problem of, or the instrument of capital control measures. The IMF allows for that if it supports macroeconomic policy adjustments. But nevertheless, if we have a look on the institutional view of the IMF, it has clearly a priority to macroeconomic policy instruments, and capital flow measures should be used only as a supporting instrument to that. Now, the problem which becomes visible here, I think, and that's a link to earlier discussions indeed, if we think about all that problems only from the point of view of a single country, the policy instruments which are possible, which can be used here, are rather limited. The problem becomes or shows to be a problem which has to do directly with the international system as such. If we have that kind of system, non-system, all instruments which can be taken from a single country are rather limited here. Let's come to our last aspect, criticism and defense of all that story. We can say we have one problem which normally is discussed heavily here, is that if you have a look on exchange rate, the attempt to influence exchange rate, it hurts other countries. So if one country has an advantage, it may create a disadvantage for other countries. So exchange rate is a relation, current account is a relation. So if one country has a surplus, the other country has to suffer the deficit the other way around. So the question here, it is some kind of zero-sum game, where at the end the equilibrium is distorted, and therefore the negative effects may be stronger than the positive effects for single countries. That's questioned, or questionable at least, if we take into consideration that both, in a certain way, reserve accumulation or quantitative easing may also contribute to globally seen stronger growth or recovery. It contributes to keep the global interest rates lower than they would otherwise be. So, is the attempt to manipulate exchange rates only negative, or may it not have expansionary effects for the overall global economy? What really would happen to the world economy if not some countries would use instruments which also can be seen as having manipulating effects on the exchange rates? Another dimension is the dimension of national policy space. If we think about the discussion, we have had it here also in the workshop quite a lot. The impossible trinity, which normally says, indeed, open markets, national policy space, fixed exchange rate are not possible all three together. So flexible exchange rate would open some policy space. We know very well from Milton Friedman his promise that indeed flexible exchange rate would increase policy space for the single countries. I would say that was an illusion from the beginning. We have also discussed that in earlier presentations here. What we see indeed is, even if we have flexible exchange rate, then the policy space, especially of emerging economies, especially of open economies, is reduced a lot. The question therefore is if the main problem of manipulation of exchange rate is not that it reduces the policy space within the single countries. If that would be the case, the only answer to that we would have to use more strongly than up to now, and more strongly than the IMF suggests, the instrument of controls of capital movement, because that would be the only instrument in order to safeguard some kind of policy space within the emerging economies. Last but not least, one afterword. The whole debate does not take into account internal devaluation. For sure, it is possible to manipulate the exchange rate, especially in an environment of fixed nominal exchange rate, or in an environment of a monetary union, by direct influence on the wage and price developments. If we think back what we have seen about the current account imbalances before, we have seen that the only country where the imbalances are not reduced in the last years but increasing is Germany. And Germany is very much relying on that instrument. Now, the strange thing here is that if we have a look on the international discussion about exchange rate manipulation, that dimension is not discussed at all. Nevertheless, I would say that if we really want to come closer to that problem, internal devaluation is at least as important as the other instruments are. Thank you.
Okay, then we should immediately continue.